Good evening. Have you ever heard of a group called the Optimist Club? I think it's actually called Optimist International, maybe is what it's called. But the Optimist Clubs, if you've ever heard of them, they were formed, the international, the big joint combined effort was formed in Louisville in 1919, so here in Kentucky. And Optimist Clubs, among other things, do different tasks, but they sponsor a lot of youth sports leagues. They sponsor essay contests for students, and they do scholarships as well as some other things as well. But it's all geared toward young folks. And in fact, the motto of the Optimist Club is called Friends of Youth. And tonight we're talking about optimism, but I wanted to mention that there at the beginning because it seems like that optimism is strongest when we're younger and often fades to when we're older, to the point where it seems like the older we get, the more we sometimes feel like more than anything, we just wait on the other shoe to drop, something bad maybe to happen. But tonight we're going to talk about optimism. And in particular, you can see there in our title, Mustard Seeds, Shining Lights, and Finding the Most Joy in Christianity. I like the picture because nothing about that picture seems to make sense, right? When you laid the first stone there was no chance that it was going to turn out like this. But if you had assigned this to someone to try and create, there's probably two views of it. An optimist would have said that'll work. A pessimist might have said that it won't. I think we are quite often, or too often, pessimistic within the church over so many different things. And a lot of times our pessimism is based on things that happened in the past. And that's probably fair because optimism and pessimism do tend to come from that. But I think if we're not careful, we let those pessimistic thoughts of things that happened in the past sort of dictate what happens in the future. And we look at things in a somewhat negative sense as a result. Let's talk a little bit about optimism in the Old Testament. We can see there in Deuteronomy chapter 31 and verse 6, we read, "Be ye strong and of good courage. Do not fear nor be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, he is the one who goes with you. He will not leave you nor forsake you." Probably familiar verses to you right there. I put the picture there because I like the picture. As you can see, those are two trapeze artist type deals that would be swinging from one rope, and that is a elephant swinging toward a little bitty monkey right there. It's very optimistic that you think that it's going to catch you. But we can see it there in the picture. Joshua 1:9, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." Jeremiah 29:11, some of you may have this hanging in your house. "For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope." That's Mary's favorite verse. We have one of those hanging up in one of our in the hallway, I believe. Psalm chapter 31 and verse 24, "Be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart, all you who hope in the Lord." All four very optimistic verses there, things that have us excited to look forward to. The New Testament, in Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, "And we know that all things work together to the good, for good to those who love God, for those who are called according to his purpose." Philippians chapter 4 and verse 13, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." John 14 and verse 27, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." No new verses on any of those, I don't believe. And finally, Revelation 21 and verse 4, "And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, no sorrow, no crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away." And as you can see, the picture that I've got there with it, the former things pass away. You're moving out of the rain and out of the clouds and into the sun. For often it seems like we rather stay right here rather than move over to the other one. So tonight, I want us to look at a couple of different things about optimism. I want to start with the parable of the mustard seed. So let's turn to Matthew chapter 13 here to start with. We're going to look at this for just a little bit, and then we're going to hit on a few different things as well. But Matthew chapter 13, Ben read the parable of the pearl, great price. We also could have looked at the persistent widow that we see in Luke chapter 18. I thought about doing that, but I decided this one instead. The problem with the parable of the mustard seed is it only takes up 2 verses. So we'll go a little bit deeper than that. But the parable of the mustard seed, Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 and 32. So I'll give you a second to get there. But I want us to think about what this is. And if you look at this picture, this is the mustard seed, and this is its growth into a tree. Some of you may be familiar with mustard seed. Some of you may not. In our neck of the woods, maybe a tobacco seed works better than a mustard seed as an explanation for this. But really, almost any kind of seed you buy, it's amazing to me, those little cartridges of seeds, there's so much in there, and they're so tiny, and they every one grow into something that is completely, it does not match what comes in the package. We'll put it that way. Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 and 32. Linda, do you care to read this? All right. So I want to think about a few different things here. The first question, to what is Jesus liken a mustard seed in this parable? Well, in the first verse, in verse 31, he said all right. So it says the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. And that doesn't seem right, does it? Because a mustard seed is what? Very small. And it's hard to imagine a kingdom being very small, right? That doesn't really seem to match up right there. Those are almost literally word for word, except replace mustard seed with pearl with what Ben read there just a few moments ago. So as the mustard seed, or after the mustard seed has been sown, according to the parable, 2 things happen. First, it is greater than what? Again, we're in verse 31 and 32 here. It is all right. It is greater. It is grown. It is greater than the herbs and becomes a what? And becomes a tree. So this tiny mustard seed becomes greater than anything else. It grows into a tree. And I don't know exactly how big a mustard tree gets, but I know how big most trees get. And most trees are much bigger than this tiny little seed that we're looking at right here. So what we see here is a bit of growth that comes from something really small into something much larger. So how can something so small produce something so big? How can something so small produce something so big?
Small comparison in all the world is just in Israel, which is just a very, very small part of the world, but through that little seed, it spread out through the entire world.
Absolutely.
A young couple can get married and have a few children, and after a while, if you do the genealogy, there's hundreds of thousands of
Sure.
relatives
Yeah.
to that family. Just from one man and one woman get married and have kids. If nothing goes wrong, it will just explode.
So, all right. Yeah, absolutely. So we think about something small and it can produce something so big. But the problem that we sometimes have is we look at something small from the get-go, and what do we immediately think? Worthless. What do we think? Something small.
Like 1 acre seems not worth anything.
Right.
It's pretty good for a squirrel.
Right.
But if you're not careful, if that acre gets in the right place, it'll grow a tree that will shade generations of people.
Sure.
And help the atmosphere and everything. Just one little acre somewhere gets going and can do all that.
So when we see something like this idea of something so small producing something so big. You know, Ben, you mentioned faith there just a minute ago, and that's we can think about that. You know, our faith may waver from time to time. It may grow or it may weaken or whatever. But to start with, we have no faith, right? I mean, our faith, and I don't know what age that comes, but if we're thinking religious, it has to be introduced to you in some form. So we start with very little, and it's going to grow into something much larger. In Luke chapter 17 and verse 6, Jesus referred to faith as a mustard seed. So what does he mean when he describes it like that? What is Jesus saying? You can turn back to Luke 17:6 if you want to and read it, but that's what we see here. So what does Jesus mean when he describes faith as a mustard seed?
Once you make it a little initial step out of you, or that little initial baptism, whatever. As long as you stay in God, that will continue to grow and grow and grow until eventually maybe you're up there preaching or teaching or whatever. Then, like your mom's case, where she taught Sunday school all the years, you know, that little faith that started out in her, you know, how far is it spread out now?
Sure. The first time somebody, to piggyback off Ben's example, when you walk out, the faith that it takes to step out into the aisle, we'll just say that. Well, you don't walk all the way up to the front and preach a 30-minute sermon the minute you walk out there, right? That's not how that works, right? Most of the time when you're walking, there's maybe some jitters, some nerves. You may remember this from whenever that day might have been with you. But as Ben said there, that's going to grow. And so when you plant that tiny seed, when you plant that mustard seed, does the tree sprout up overnight? Is it taller than this building, the next morning when you get up? No, it's the same way. Jimmy, you raised a whole lot of tobacco the same way, right? You plant that seed. When is the tobacco up here? It takes a little while, right? It's a whole lot of work between here and between here, right? Too much work, probably, that's there in between. So Jesus describes faith in that same way. There has to be some growth that's there. But if we look at something really small and from the get-go we say, well, that's not going to work, we're looking at that from a pessimistic sense. So let's imagine that Christian or that person who's about to become a Christian, if they walk out of the aisle and the first thing we say is, well, it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to be hard for you to do this. It'll be really tough for you. What kind of attitude is that? How many of you have ever heard, after somebody was baptized or whatever, heard somebody utter a phrase similar to this? That's the best decision you'll ever make. We've probably all heard something like that. Now, how many of you have ever heard somebody after that, they said something along the lines of, now it's time to start doing some work for God or something like that? All right. Well, you don't immediately start preaching, but there's growth. If you plant the seed, but you don't water it, what's going to happen to it? It's going to die. So there's got to be some growth. But there's a lot of people that have to factor in to this. And a lot of times there has to be some luck that factors into it as well. You talked about an acorn. There's a whole lot of acorns that fall to the ground and rot away, right? But there's a lot of oak trees too. So something happened somewhere with some of them. Now, we have to work to help grow other people. But sometimes some things just sort of have to happen along the way as well. But if we look at everything in this negative sense, we're not going to grow anything. Question 5. What role does optimism play in our own faith?
If you're always negative and looking at it and thinking that you'll fail, you'll never succeed. When you go out the first time you witness to someone, if you're so scared of what they're rejecting you and everything else, you're going to defeat yourself. When you go into talk to someone, if you're not confident in what yourself, if you're not confident in what their response will be, you'll kill the devil before you start. It's like College Ray said, he could never go out there and sell sheds because he's a foreman. He never be able to do it successfully because he didn't leave.
Do you know what a oxymoron is? It's one word. If something is an oxymoron, it's two things that are not compatible. Okay? Army intelligence, I guess, if you want that. That's, I don't know. I didn't say that. That's right here. All right. But is pessimistic faith an oxymoron? Faith is something that you're just sort of hoping for, right? Because the thing about faith is the biblical definition or whatever is you're hoping for something, right? What's the definition of faith that we sometimes give? Substance of things what? Hope for. Evidence of what? Things what? Not seen. Well, none of those things are real in the sense of I am holding on to faith. No, I'm holding on to a shirt. That's not what it is. So when we think about faith, we are hoping for something greater. So can there be pessimistic faith? It's impossible. But do you know pessimistic Christians? I struggle with that. I struggle with the fact that we can't have pessimistic faith, but we can have a room full of people who would describe themselves as pessimistic. I don't know. That's a good question. Where would you put Thomas at? Well, I think Thomas doubted. He asked for some proof, right? But whenever the proof was shown to him, how does Thomas respond? He says, my Lord and my God. So it changed. So I think Thomas would have been described as pessimistic if he had said, no chance, that's Jesus, and then left. But he didn't approach it. Maybe so. Sure. So optimism plays a vital role because we have faith that when our life is over, where will we end? Go to heaven. Have you ever talked to anybody who's went to heaven? No. It's not the way that works, is it? In fact, the Bible tells us there, what about the rich man and Lazarus, right? He wanted to do what? When he was sitting there in just the worst situation, he wanted to do what? He said, well, he wanted somebody to go tell his brothers, and God said, it's just not possible, right? It's impossible. He said, besides, there's a huge gulf that's fixed that you couldn't stretch from one to the other anyway. But that faith is what keeps us coming back, this hope of something. So there has to be some optimism in there. So those of us who might lean on the pessimistic side, I'd still argue that there's some optimism in there as well.
I think with our faith in God, optimism is important. I think optimism is important when you choose to get married, when you choose to have children, when you choose to go to work. There's some days at post office that was hard. I mean, they were bad days, and it was easy to lose your faith, that, well, I don't know what the end result is going to be. It's killing me, this is. And sometimes marriages are that way, or, raising children, there's some dark days and hard days. But you say, well, I know there'll be some dark days in the marriage. I know there'll be some dark days at the post office with my job. I know there'll be some dark days raising you, but I'm going to do it anyway, okay? It's just like being a Christian. It's not all flowers and roses.
Sure.
It's not. There's hard times. There's controversies. There's arguments. People get mad. So it's not all optimistic, but you still walk by faith, not by sight, and you press on. And that carries you to your job, your marriage, whatever. It gets you to the end result.
So, anybody else want to add anything to number 6 up there? I think that answered that pretty good. But what's the main teaching then of this parable? Because I hadn't even asked it, but you kind of delved into that a little bit. But what's the main teaching of this parable? What's Jesus? These are words of Jesus here in Matthew 13. So, what's he teaching? We have to have faith, right? Optimistic faith is unquenchable. Makes sense. Sure. Others on the last one.
And then we'll go back to our tree or oak tree. You may see an oak tree that's got a really bad crook in it, okay? The reason it's got a really bad crook is because of the wind or a tree fell into it. Something bad happened along the way.
Right.
And it's got this, but it still persevered and it made its way to the skyline, and where it can be a majestic oak, okay?
Yep.
That mighty seed that he's talking about is planted in everybody's heart by God. Jesus says, no one can come to me unless the Father first calls. So God plants that seed in every one of our hearts. And as long as you keep your heart open, successful to it, don't let it be the stony ground or the hard ground and stuff like that, and keep an optimistic view of it. Jesus says over time, it's going to be this giant tree. And Google, mustard tree.
Yeah.
And it is a huge giant tree. It looks like a big tree out past it. So,
Right.
And all the animals in the world can get under it. He says, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time, but when it finally matures, it's going to be this big, beautiful thing that can shelter all of your family and neighbors and everything.
Other thoughts on the last one? We're going to move forward here in just a second, but just three things that I've written down, the main teachings or thoughts on this parable. One, don't place limits on things. We look at a mustard seed and we already limit it, right? It can't be any better because it's so small. We can't put limits on things. Do we put limits on our faith sometimes? Second thing, don't fret about what's impossible. We look at a seed and we plant that seed, and the first thing we think of is, well, it'll be really hard for this to grow. It'll be really difficult for this. It's just going to be almost impossible for this to grow. And then it grows up a little bit, and like, well, ain't much, here it is. But if we're not careful, we spend all of our time thinking this can't really be any better than what it is. What if that happens in the church? This can't be any better than what it is. Is that a negative, pessimistic attitude to have? Of course, and people have that. The third thing, we got to let the light shine just a little bit. And that's what we're going to talk about here for the rest of the time. Let our light shine. Light is, by definition, optimistic. I think that's something that it opens things up. Darkness is more pessimistic. So let's, first of all, we're going to look at 4 ways. I think it's 4. It might have been 5. I think it's 4, though. 4 ways that we can sort of be optimistic. And these are some verses and some thoughts as well. So I'll call on you. They may not show up. They're a little smaller just because I've tried to get 4 things on for each one. But the first verse here is Titus chapter 2, verses 11 through 14. Titus 2, 11 to 14. Melvina, do you care to read Titus 2, 11 to 14? So the first thought here is to live a righteous life. What does that mean to be righteous? God-like, to do the right thing. So why would an optimist want to live a righteous life?
Believe in God's promises.
Okay, believe in God's promises. What else?
It's the best life possible.
Okay.
You show me somebody that's always breaking the law, in and out of jail, in and out of rehab. That's a problematic life. Okay?
Sure.
And there's never any comfort. A righteous life is comfortable, in so many ways. Things are decent in order at the Bible.
Sure.
I think the main reason to live a righteous life is have gratitude and thankfulness to what the righteousness that was given us. We're none of us righteous on our own.
Yeah, no, not one.
With Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit helping us. So the main goal for living a righteous life is not to earn your way to heaven, you've already got it, but it is to honor the one who gave you such a great one.
Absolutely. Second one, James 1 and 27 says to live unspotted from the world. Jill, do you care to read James 1, 27? And this is really a difficult passage, right? This is a challenge for all to do, but to live unspotted from the world, because it's easy to get spotted, right? How many of you have ever spilled something before? Like probably more times than not for some of us. Every white T-shirt I own has got the taco drippings on them, every single one of them that I have. And we'll have supper, and then, about halfway through the meal, Mary will look at me and she'll say, "Oh, I noticed this is a plain white T-shirt. I can't even eat tacos in like I could never eat them out in public because you'd have to wear something real then. I've got a T-shirt and a hose in the back trying to spray me down after it's over with. But it's if we're not careful, every time I have ever sat down to eat tacos, I have never once said, I long to spill this down my shirt. But what happens if you're not careful? It spills right down. So what happens if we're not careful? James 1:27. We can be spotted. Now, I've never once tried to pour tacos down my shirt, but sometimes that just happens. Sometimes it just happens. But if we're working really hard, we have to try really hard to avoid being spotted. Then any kind of thing there can be difficult for us. Third one.
Jesus describes that in the judgment scene. They say, well, when have you seen us,
Yes.
do these bad things? And he said, in as much as you did it not for the least one of these, you did everything.
Yes.
So those people are spotted at the judgment scene that Jesus is talking about. And you can go around and say, well, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't see anything. But did you look at the people that was hungry? Well, no, I have to keep myself pure. And if you're not careful, then you let yourself in the spot.
A lot of times, it's not what we do wrong. A lot of times, it's the right things to do.
Romans 12 verses 1 and 2 there to continue with the living a righteous life. Do not be conformed to the world. Leland, do you care to read Romans 12, 1 and 2, sir? The third verse here goes after the second one, right? Because it's easy to become spotted if we're not careful, but if we're not conformed, if we're in a sense, as Leland just read there, sort of working to avoid that, it's much easier to avoid the spotting, if we want to keep using the term there from James. The fourth one, be separate from the world. Connie, do you care to read? This is 2 Corinthians 6, verses 17 and 18. So when we think about this notion of living a righteous life, as I was kind of prepping for this and thinking about this, I was thinking about how if we're not really careful, we can paint everybody in a really negative way. These people are just awful. People are terrible. Well, we've always said that. And if you say something long enough, you'll start to believe it, right? And that's, if we go back to optimistic, pessimistic, then we can fall into that sort of pessimistic version. Well, are there bad people in the world? Yes. Were there when every one of these verses were written? But what if some of the people had chosen to just fall in there with them, just to stay on that pessimistic side? What would have been the long-term effects? What if more people had said, I'm going to be pessimistic rather than optimistic? How would that have hurt the church going forward? I'm sorry. It would have died out. It wouldn't have been anything close to what it becomes. And so if our goal is to preach and teach the word of God, if our goal is to grow the church, we can't fall into the pessimistic trap there. We can't say, well, everybody else is doing it, so why can't I? But also, we have to keep this sort of optimistic sense that what I'm doing is beneficial not only for me, but for people going forward as well. Second, do good works. First of all, in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10, we read that the Christian is created to do good works. Annette, do you care to read Ephesians 2 and 10? All right. So have we ever thought, well, I'm not going to do that because I don't think it's going to help anything? You ever had that thought before? it's a pessimistic thought, first of all. But we are created to do what? To do good works. And people fuss and fight about this all the time, working your way into heaven and all that. But that's not the point of this right here, is that we're created. Our responsibility is to do good works. I mean, if we read later to know to do good and do it not, that's what? We read that that's sin. And so one of the ways to stay optimistic is to stay doing positive things. Keep working towards something that's beneficial. We're to do good to all men. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10. Lucille, do you care to read this one? Galatians 6 and 10. So our responsibility is to do good to all people, right? Our responsibility is to do, but they won't appreciate it, right? They won't appreciate it. They'll waste this. I feel like we've talked about this a little bit before, but if we approach things with, I'm going to do this for her, but there ain't no way she's going to appreciate it, what's wrong with that attitude? We're doing it for the wrong reasons. But do we ever approach things that way? Of course we do. Yeah. A little bit. A little bit.
And also, like in the verse before that, about you are to come out and be separate from the unemployment and the ones that don't do right, but that doesn't mean you don't run with them and do what they do, but you still are good to them.
Sure. The third one here, produce the fruit of the Spirit. It's been several months back. I partnered you up and y'all had fruits of the Spirit partners, and everybody had to move seats, and some of y'all seemed like you was in total foreign land by the time it was over with. Some of y'all thought it was the best night ever, and some of y'all might have thought it was the worst. I won't point at who thought what. But Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, we read, but the fruit of the Spirit, and there's several of these here. Fruit of the Spirit is love. What's the next one? Joy, peace, long-suffering or patience. What's next? Kindness or gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and what else? And self-control. Against such, there is no law. And so those are all things that it says produce the fruit of the Spirit. So to produce something means what? You got to grow it. You got to make it. You have to produce something. So does that mean it's going to require some effort on our part? To do good works, that's going to require some effort on our part. But we're told that that work that we're doing, that love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control is work that we're doing to do what? What's the purpose of this? What's the point of this? To produce good works. The fruit of the what? It's capitalized. This is not the fruit of Daniel or the fruit of the building. It's the fruit of the Holy Spirit. It's a responsibility, a requirement for us. Yeah.
Every time I see that verse, I think about, can you imagine somebody going down to the judge's office or the police office and said, well, my neighbor, he is just so peaceful, I can't believe it. Or he is so full of joy. The policeman goes, what are you talking about? That's
Sure.
wonderful.
Right.
Those are all in any of them. He's really practicing self-control. Well, what a nice thing to do. Any of those things. And that deflates the enemy, those things right there.
It does.
Really deflates it. And they lift you up.
But if I love you, they're probably not going to love me back.
Love them anyway.
If I'm good to them, they probably won't be good back to me. That's a pessimistic viewpoint. How easy, though, is it to fall into that? Super easy. Third one, have a forgiving spirit. A lot of times we're pessimistic because we struggle to forgive, right? So I have this negative impression because they've done something wrong and I'm going to have a hard time forgiving them. And I know what they've done. And so I don't really have a whole lot of faith in them going forward. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 32. Dad, you care to read that one?
Be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even as God in Christ forgave you.
We've talked there's nobody here is hearing Ephesians 4:32 for the first time right there. But who was the best forgiver of all? Jesus. Did we deserve it? Do we still deserve it? Not really. Do we still mess up even after we've been forgiven? We of course do. And we continue to see that forgiveness. Now, if Jesus can do it, why can't I? Well, but Jesus doesn't know what I've had to go through, right? Is that we sometimes fall into that trap if we're not careful. Yes.
God's love is so much greater than earth. But Jesus was man.
Yeah.
When he forgave him on the cross, he was man.
Yep.
When he forgave the Pharisees for always fighting against him, when he forgave Judas,
Yes.
Judas was leading him to death, he kissed him and said, "Free." Well,
Yep.
do what you got to do.
But we struggle with it. We need to properly reflect Christ. What does it mean to reflect? You have reflectors. You've seen reflectors on the road. They put those little reflectors down. They put them down between the yellow lines. And when it's dark, when your light hits that, what happens? They shine back up. Why don't they shine during the day? Why don't they shine at 2 o'clock when you're driving to town to the store or whatever? It's not dark. There's nothing to reflect, right? You're not shooting any light to them. But we need to properly reflect Christ. When Christ's light shines on us, what do we have to do? It needs to bounce off and shine back. Luke 23 and verse 34, then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." Daniel or Ben or Jimmy or Lucille 23 and verse 34 says, "Father, they have made me mad and I ain't ever forgiven them," right? That's what our verse a lot of times says, isn't it? But that's not at all what Jesus said. What color are the words up there on the screen? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. How many times have you uttered that sentence? Probably with your eyes rolling back in your head, trying not to think bad thoughts, right? But we have to reflect that, because if we can't forgive, is there a home for us in heaven? Be hard, right? Be tough, because Jesus forgave us.
And all those reflectors, they work the same in the daytime as they do in the night. But you don't notice them in the
Yep.
day because it's so bright. That's the same way with us. If you're just doing good to those who do good to you, it's not going to shine very bright.
Right.
If you're reflecting in the dark and things are not going your way, when people are doing bad, that's when that light's really going to stand right with the shine.
Absolutely. That's way better than what I wrote down. Thank you, Ben. That was a lot better. All right, the next one. Follow the example of Stephen. Real quick. Stephen, this is Acts chapter 7 and verse 60, but this is about 10 verses in Acts chapter 7. Do we know what happened with Stephen? First of all, do we know why Stephen was in trouble in the first place? He was preaching Jesus. If you turn to Acts chapter 7, Stephen actually says a few things that probably you don't want to say in front of the judge or in front of the people that are maybe trying you. Acts chapter 7 and verse 51, we read, these are the words of Stephen. He says, "You stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears, ! You always resist the Holy Spirit, as your fathers did, so do you." Stephen says, he calls them names in a sense, and he says, you reject the Holy Spirit, but it ain't nothing new. Your dads did the exact same thing. So not only are they insulting you, they're insulting the family there as well, Stephen's saying. But Stephen is telling them this because they have done what to the preaching and teaching of Jesus? They had crucified him. In verse 52, which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who foretold the coming of the just one, of whom you now have become the betrayers and murderers, who have received the law by the direction of angels and have not kept it. So Stephen gives 3 verses right here of just excoriation against the people that are putting him on trial. Imagine saying that to the judge right there. What happened to Stephen? They took him right out and they stoned him right there on the spot. What does Acts chapter 7 and verse 60 say right here? Stephen said, "Lord, do not charge them with this sin." And when he had said this, he fell asleep. So Stephen had spoken the truth, had immediately been punished, and been punished in a cruel way that brought death upon him. And the last words that he says is, don't charge them with the sin. The actual words that probably should have said was, they should all be charged with this. They were 100% in the wrong. We say that, right? But the example of Stephen is what? When somebody sins against us, what do we need to do? We got to let it roll off our backs. It's hard. Our forgiveness is contingent on forgiving others. Matthew 6, 14 and 15. Tony, do you care to read that one? It's pretty straightforward, right? I believe it's written in red there as well. This is right kind of square in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus outlines it pretty simple. If you forgive people when they sin against you, who's going to forgive you? God. But what if you don't? Pretty tough. So we have to have a forgiving spirit, but it has to be optimistic in that, because if we're not careful, that pessimism drives us. I can't forgive you. You do all these wrong things. That's the pessimistic attitude right there. Right, that's true. Excuse me. That's true. Last one. So we need to be optimistic about our service to the Lord. That's what I want us to go with tonight. These are our last things right there. First of all, optimism is the result of a favorable outlook. We talked about that a minute ago. Optimism is akin to faith. Pessimism is akin to doubt and gloom. You know anybody doubt? You know any doubtful people? Any gloomy people? Man, you can't wait to leave their house, can you? You just can't wait to go into the next aisle at the grocery store when you deal with those people. But you see there, when life and problems must be faced in a practical way, excuse me, we'll start that. While life and its problems must be faced in a practical way, one's outlook, whether optimistic or pessimistic, will determine whether he deals with his problems through strength or through weakness. We have to face every problem that comes to us. And we have to be practical about it. Ben, you've talked about, giving money to help somebody or whatever. And, sometimes you're just going to get messed over. And sometimes you have to make decisions about whether or not this is the right thing for me to do. What do I need to do right here? So there has to be a practicable sense to it. But if every person we see, we automatically think the negative about, is that a practical approach? No. A practical approach is I'm going to assess this based on whatever comes right here and right there. And too often we've made our decision before that situation ever comes up. That's when we show that pessimistic side right there. I'm not going to help. I'm never going to help because one time or other times somebody has not handled it the way I thought or something like that. We can deal with life's problems from a position of strength and optimism because we have the help of who? We have the help of Christ. We have the aid of Christ. In Philippians chapter 4 and verse 13, we read it at the start. I saved it again. I wanted it here at the end. Philippians 4 and verse 13 says, I can do all things through, you say that part, through Christ, who does what? Who strengthens me. I'm not strong. Where does my strength come from? Through Christ. And so I look at this, and if I say I'm not strong, is that optimistic or is that pessimistic? I'm not strong. Just those words.
Well, I think it'd be very optimistic for a Christian. Because I'm leaning on Jesus.
There you go. So when we hear someone say, I'm not strong, I don't have that strength, you might be looking at it as a negative sense. But we know who is providing the strength. Who am I leaning on? Who is providing that for me? And so tonight, my hope is that you've taken something from this. This may have been somewhat simplistic, but I spend a whole lot of time with people who are very pessimistic. I spend a lot of time with people who at work or whatever that kind of drive me down. And you may have the same thing. And I really struggle with that because it's a lot easier to get pulled down than it is to get pulled up or pushed up or lifted up or whatever the term you want to use right there. But I would encourage all of us within the church, there can be no success in the church if we're always pessimistic about what's going to happen. We shouldn't do that because it'll never work. Well, it's not going to work. But if we look at something and say, we can do something from this, we can do this, and it might help us grow a little bit. I think about the house to house, heart to hearts. How many of you all like to read those magazines? How many of you have talked to people who have told you they like to read those magazines? How many of you know people that attend this church because of that magazine? Was only 2 or 3, 4? Do we sometimes say that? We spent all that money and 3 people started coming to church. How many was coming before? 3 less than that, right? What's it worth? So that optimistic approach is what has to be there. We can't start from the negative, you got to start from the positive. And perhaps no more optimistic person that ever came along than Jesus, right? No more. How many times should Jesus have gotten down and out? How many times do you see it? He's hanging on the cross doing what? Dying on the cross. But what's he doing with people beside him? He's forgiving them. That doesn't make a lick of sense, right? But it's what he was doing, right?
You know, I was just thinking, you go to Walmart tomorrow, and somebody said, well, how's everything going at church? Well, we just had 16 last night, or 18, whatever. Or what if you said, we had 18 last night, we had a great Bible study.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the same words, and, you know, it's just the way you deliver it.
Sure.
We had a pretty good service. We had a great service, you know, we sang, praised God, prayed to God, and studied from His Word. I feel good about being there.
Sure.
It's all of it to the Word.
So the charge is optimism. The charge is to be excited. The charge is to take this and go forward with it. I've enjoyed these. We're not done. I don't mean that with these verses or with these lessons. I've enjoyed these lessons, though. Sometimes they come across, when I'm preparing them, they seem a little simplistic, but I think they're kind of good kicks sometimes in the hind end, or maybe just a little extra light of fire for us to go forward with as well. So try to be more optimistic. Try to be going forward. The glass, let's look at the glass as what, half full rather than half empty right there. If there's anything we can do, any way to help you, whatever it can be, whatever we can do, we'd invite you to come while we stand and sing.